Okay, I was born at home to Polish-American immigrant parents in Elk Ridge, Maryland, on November 11th, 1922. Elk Ridge was very close to Baltimore, Maryland. The home we lived in had no running water, no heating system, internal heating system, had no electricity. So it was a home that was adequate for us because we knew of nothing else. But it was nothing like we have homes today. The house was located on a 13-acre piece of property, mostly wooded, but it did have a garden spot. We raised cows, and that provided us with milk, butter, and cheese. We raised chickens, and they would provide us with eggs and many a Sunday dinner. Of course, having these animals that created many, many chores. In fact, nothing was ever finished, not even on weekends. When I was old enough to go to school, we were Catholic, and I was to be enrolled in a parochial school. However, my parents never spoke any language other than Polish, so that was my language. I didn't have any inkling of English at all. However, when I went to be enrolled, they couldn't understand me. The nuns could not understand me. So my parents essentially had a sister that lived in Baltimore, and I was sent there to go to a Polish English school, and I did that for a year, learned English, enough English to be able to enroll in a local public parochial school. And I essentially was able to go through my 8 years of parochial school, and then I was enrolled in a public school. The parochial school was about 3 miles away from our home, and there was no bus transportation. So I walked that 3 miles to and from school, whether it was rain, shine, or snow. When I went to the high school, of course, there was bus transportation, and my walking days were over then. When I was enrolled in the public school system, I was enrolled in the academic classes, and that was to prepare me for college. But my parents had no money to send me to college, so anyway, I had a disadvantage because the academic courses did not have typing as one of their courses, so I never learned to type. And I wish I had, because in today's environment, that is almost a necessity. After I graduated from high school, which was in 1941, I sought a job at the Glenn Martin Company, and this was at the start of World War II, at least for the United States it was. And I had a problem because when I was enrolled in parochial school, the nuns, my name was Micah, M-A-J-K-A, and when my father told them that, they put down the Michael, and I was known as Michael from that point on. In fact is, I even got my driver's license at 16 under the name of Anthony Michael. So in order to be able to seek a job in a plant that actually provided government materials, I had to have my name changed legally so that I could prove my citizenship. So that was done, and I got a job at the Glenn Martin Company building B-26 Marauder bombers, which were used principally in northern Africa. I worked as a sheet metal and aluminum welder at that job. I had a deferment to do that work until 1944, and my deferment was essentially canceled, and I was drafted in the Army. Of course, I left my job and went for training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, in 1940, the fall of 1944. There was a 16-week basic training session, and after that, I was trained in an 81 millimeter mortar outfit. When that was finished, I had essentially gotten 2 weeks leave, which was around Christmas time of 1944. And in January 2nd, I boarded the Queen Mary in New York Harbor, which took me and a lot of other people across the ocean we landed at the Forth of Firth in Scotland. And from there, we were taken by train to Southampton and landed craft across the channel to Le Havre, France. Here, I had an experience that was a little bit different from what I had on stateside. Everything was rationed. Gasoline was rationed. Even in my basic training on the gun range, where we used ammunition that was spent. The cartridges had to be accounted for, and every one of them was recycled. But when I got to Le Havre, gasoline was no problem. We had a pile of brush and boards and stuff like that, and they just poured the gasoline over it and lit a fire to keep us warm. Bandoliers of ammo were laying in the mud, which was an experience that was very foreign to me, but that's what it was. So here we waited for railroad cars to take us to the battle line, which was in Wiltz, Luxembourg. These railroad cars were called 40 and 8s, 40 men or 8 horses. And we were loaded into these cars, and we started off for Wiltz, Luxembourg. Well, our first stop was for breakfast. This was done, we started off at night, started breakfast. When we woke up, the whole top of the car had frost all over it. And of course, that means that we were breathing a lot. And we had breakfast, and I don't know what was in that breakfast, but I think everybody threw it back up. We finally arrived in Wiltz, Luxembourg, and there was another 81 millimeter mortar outfit that had been online for about 3 weeks. The ground was covered with about 17 inches of snow. The temperatures were in the low 20s, and it was not a pleasant sight. However, when we got there, instead of the old outfit picking up all of their equipment, we let them have our equipment, and we let the mortar emplacement as it was, and we used it. That first night, I actually stood 2 hours of guard duty, got up in the morning, and myself and another crewman went out to the gun emplacement, to the mortar emplacement, and we found that they did not have a foxhole dug. So we turned to each other and he says, "You think we should dig a foxhole?" And I said, "Yeah, we should dig a foxhole." He said, "Well, where do you want to dig it?" So I said, "Let's start digging it here." So we started, and the other crewman said, "I don't think we should dig it there." I said, "Well, where do you want to dig it?" And he went about 30 feet away and said, "Let's dig it here." So we dug a foxhole big enough for us to stand up in it. We had some felled logs there. We piled those on top of that. And as we were finishing in that foxhole, the Germans started shelling us. And of course, we got into the foxhole and waited until the shelling was over. And when the shelling was over and we got out of the foxhole, we found that there was a direct hit where we started our first foxhole. And if we had been there, I wouldn't be telling this story today. Incidentally, I had my first cigarette in my life after that incident.
You think your friend had a premonition?
I don't know. I think he was a guardian angel. I had many of those throughout my whole sojourn there. But anyway, we were essentially at the bulge. And the bulge, we were trying to take back the ground that the Germans had essentially taken, and they put up a fierce fight. We had, there was one incident where we were at a place where the Germans had a stronghold. There was a Siegfried and Maginot line that they had essentially held in place. And my sergeant said that instead of having the 300 radio, he wanted a hard line in there. So I started to put the whole hard line in, and it had to cross the Saar River. Now, the Saar River had a bridge across it, and it had a wall on either side of it so that you could duck down in between it, and the people in the on the Siegfried line couldn't really see me. And it actually, the road actually went into a pot and pan factory. And we had to get through that, but you had to be careful because pots and pans make a lot of noise if you disturb them. So I ran the wire all the way through there, through a school gymnasium, and down into the basement of one of the houses where we were going to essentially make a raid on the Siegfried line. Well, when we did that and we got positioned, the Germans start really shelling us. However, we also ordered a tank to come and essentially help us. Well, we took the mines out of the roadway and put them against the walls of the house. And when the tank came in, they came in close to the house and blew a track off the tank. Of course, the people in the tank then came in to the basement where we were located and stayed there. So essentially, the mission was practically aborted because we couldn't do anything without that tank. And so we waited until the shelling stopped, and we essentially went back to the area across the Saar River. Also, we were beginning to run out of ammo for our 81 millimeter mortars, so we had captured some 60 millimeter mortars from the Germans, and we had plenty of their ammo. So we adapted the system so that we could use the 60 millimeter mortars. However, we found that when we start firing these things, they had more misfires than they had real live fires. And in order to clear the barrel of the 60 millimeter mortar barrels, you had to uncouple it from the bipod, unscrew the portion that was in the base plate, lift it up, and essentially let the unexpired mortar come out of the barrel. And my job was to essentially grab that mortar as it came out of the barrel. Of course, when that happens, the firing pin, which was essentially traveling along the barrel, went out, and that meant that the head of the mortar was live. So we had a whole cord of these things. It looked like a cord of wood piled up on the side of the yard there where we were in. And
why didn't you just tip the mortar and pour the round back out the way it came in?
That's the way we did it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's only one way to put the mortar in, is at the end of the barrel, and let it slide down. And then if it didn't go off, you had a mortar in there that you couldn't use the 81 millimeter mortar at all. So the only way to get it out is to tip the thing over so that you could capture it and get it out, or else get blown up.
What did you do with the duds?
We piled them up as cords of wood, and we had big piles of them. And we left them there. Somebody else had to clean them up sometime or another. But pretty soon we had crossed the Saar River and essentially headed up toward the Rhine. And once we got into Germany, we essentially were a cleanup crew for the 4th Armored, which went through rapidly, and then of course you had all sorts of emplacements that the Germans had, snipers and things of this nature. And I remember going through town. It wasn't a town. It was about maybe 12 to 14 houses on either side of the road. And apparently when the armored went through, all the houses had white flags on them, which meant surrender, except for one storefront, which actually housed, I don't know, grain and stuff like that they sold there. And that was right at the head of this thing. And when the armored came through with their recon car, they fired, the Tiger tank fired on them and killed both of the occupants there. So the 4th Armored actually got backed off, and they leveled every house in that town. I don't know whether there were any occupants there or not, but there certainly weren't any occupants when we went through there. And there were many towns like this, although if they had white flags, usually honored that, because that meant surrender. We came to a town called Fulda, Germany, and that was a pretty big town. And there, most of the buildings were marked with red crosses, which meant either hospital or some disability thing. And so it wasn't my turn to carry the 300 radio of another crewman. In fact, he was from Philadelphia. His name was Montagna. And he carried the 300 radio, and we set up on the hillside outside the city and prepared ourselves to essentially provide support when it was called for from the infantry, which was right on the front line. But we didn't fire a shot, and they apparently secured the city, even though it was pretty rough. But as we were going into Fulda, again, we intercepted an area of about 14 or 12 houses, and we were going through that road toward the city, and the Germans began to shell us. And the shell hit the crew just ahead of us. But when that happened, I jumped off that Jeep so quickly that my helmet hit me in the back. Grabbed the helmet and headed for the basement of the house. And I went through that glass right into the basement. And I don't know who was more frightened, me or the chickens in there. But we of course, after things settled down, then we got out. I got out of the basement, and the individual that got hit right in between the legs, and our medic went up and gave him some morphine, but he died right there. So that was Fulda. Now the rest of going across Germany was you still get rifle fire, sniper fire. there was another incident where we were going on a road and I could see the sniper essentially leading the Jeep, and you could see it hitting in the banks. But we somehow survived that. And we got into, this was a little smaller town, and I got off the Jeep and I had my carbine on me, and I was trying to get through a screen door fence, and as I did that, my carbine caught on the two posts, and man, I thought I'd knock myself out, but I recovered from that and went in, and that was the last incident that occurred that was that frightening. After that, we went across central Germany, and we would see, Germans surrendering. So what we would do is essentially take their guns away, break them up, and point them in the back direction, and told them somebody would pick them up.
What time was this? Month, year?
This would be about May or late April of 1945. But anyway, they would, when we broke their guns up and pointed them in the right direction, they said, "Why are you breaking our guns up? We'll help you fight the Russians." And at that time, we thought the Russians were our friends.
Well, you were literally breaking their weapons apart.
Yeah, yeah. So, anyway, we went across Germany, and we never slept out in the field anymore. We always confiscated a house that we stayed overnight. And we finally met the Russians in Lehenic, Czechoslovakia. And that was in early June of 1945. Lehenic had a lot of cherry trees in there, and the cherries were beginning to become ripe. Somebody said that it was the cherry capital of Europe, but I can't verify one way or the other. But we stayed there about 4 weeks, and I was in the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division at that time. That's where I was a replacement back in Wiltz, Luxembourg. And they had enough points to go home, and I didn't. So I was transferred to the Buckeye Division, and we were getting ready to be shipped to Hammelburg, Germany. It was a Wehrmacht training center, and we were packaging up, and then the atomic bomb was dropped in Japan. We were going to be trained to be sent over to the Pacific Theater. So the Buckeye Division had enough points to go home. I still didn't have enough points to go home.
How do you recruit points?
By the number of days that you were there. And I was a replacement very late in the stage of the war, so I hadn't accumulated that many points. So I was essentially got into a military police outfit. That was Army of Occupation in Austria. And I spent the rest of my time there from, I guess it was July of 55 through I guess August of 56.
46.
46, yeah, you're right, 46. And that was a very pleasant, because we had access to all of the facilities there, and one of them was Lake Gmunden, and there they had a recording over the rainbow. I think we listened to that until we wore it out. Judy Garland. But we had access to other facilities there, especially the German facilities. And that was a pleasant sojourn. When I was there, I had a week's furlough to London, England. It took, there was two of us, a fellow from Philadelphia, his name was Kagan, and I were granted that leave, and we still had to find our own transportation. Sometimes we walked. But it took us a month to get to London, England. And the first thing I had there was liver and onions. And we spent our mostly around Trafalgar Square. It took us about the same amount of time to get back to Austria. But there we had, of course, you had military police duty, but you had a lot of time on your hands, so we played cards and smoked cigarettes. By that time, I was smoking cigarettes. And but in 46, I left for home. And the trip back was not like the Queen Mary that I had come across initially. It was one of those troop ships that I thought we hit a storm and I thought we were going to break in half. But we did finally land in New York, and I had a half a pack of cigarettes, and I threw them away, and that was the last cigarette that I had, and I have never smoked since. I got home and was rotated out of the service, and at that time, the federal government had an arrangement with the facilities that actually employed those veterans to take them back. So I went back for, I guess it was 2 months, and I told them that I had enrolled in the University of Maryland to start my college career. And I had, before I had left the Glenn Martin Company, I was engaged to a girl there that I had met at my workplace. And of course, she dropped me somewhere during my combat. So that was over. And anyway, I started my college in September of 46. And things were hard because I had not, I'd gone out of high school pretty long time ago. So getting back into the swing of things was a little bit rough. And the other thing was that my parents still couldn't put me in a dorm there, so I lived at home. The distance between College Park and my home was about 32 miles. And the way I got back and forth to school was by hitchhiking. I was very successful at that. The roughest one was when I had a 5 o'clock class, which ended at 6, and you got on the road at 6 o'clock in the wintertime. It was dark. So that was the hardest part. But most of the people that actually gave me a ride were people that worked in Washington, D.C. And I was very successful that way. But in 1949, I was invited to a wedding of a good friend of ours in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I met the love of my life there. And we actually got engaged about 4 months after I'd met her. And I started building a house for us. My mother had accumulated the money that I had gotten as military pay, and that was enough to be a down payment for that house. And we planned to get married in June of the following year, in 1949. And we'd only seen ourselves 7 times before we were married. We had a wedding. There's probably around 600 people that attended that wedding. And at that time, it cost my mother-in-law, her father had died, so it was only her mother. Probably paid about $1,000 for that wedding, because the neighbors fixed all the food and everything else.
That would have been a lot of money.
That was what?
$1,000 is a lot of money in 1949.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So anyway, on June 18th of 1946, 49, it was not 46, but 49, we got married. And of course, we had a very short honeymoon up to Niagara Falls, and then came back home, and the house was finished. So we moved in. And I had 1 more year of college yet to go. So the only breadwinner was my wife, who moved from Bella, PA down to Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company and worked for the telephone company. Our monthly payments on the house were $56. And we survived the year that I had to still go to school when I graduated in 1950 as a mechanical engineer. And I went back to the Martin Company at that time and started as a mechanical engineer for 45 cents an hour. It wasn't too long when they put us on a monthly salary, but that's what I started on. And
What was your pay previously at that same plant?
At 25 cents an hour.
Talk to me. Give us a little more detail about what it was like to grow up a Polish-speaking boy in America. Were you surrounded by other Poles? Were you in a community that spoke a language you didn't know?
No, there was a Lithuanian family, but they spoke English. You know, I changed my name, but at that time, a lot of people were changing their names because they didn't want to be associated with an ethnic group. So it was much like, I guess, the Muslims are now, although United States sort of puts a kibosh on that, so that they are not as mistreated as the Irish up in New York and the Polish down in Baltimore.
So were you in a Polish community?
No. We were on a farm, and that farm, the next farm was probably another 12 miles away.
So you essentially grew up just with you and your family?
Yeah.
Any interesting childhood stories you'd like to relate? If you've got anything you can provide.
I'm trying to think.
Not really. The firstborn child was a girl, and she was physically unable to walk until she was about 8 years old. And she was mentally retarded also. So my mother had her hands full, and she had children about every 18 months. There were 9 of us. So, but we had a family that lived on another farm. They were the Van sisters, and they were spinsters. And occasionally they would come to our house. And of course they liked to play with the baby. But we had an Airedale dog that was so protective that they better not touch that child. But other than that, I mean, we raised horses too, because we plowed with horses. So on the weekend, we would bareback ride the horses around, play kickball. That was about it. And then it was chores.
Yeah. So, Dad, your mom and Dad, I think, came over on the boat, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What port did they come through?
I don't know.
Don't know. Okay, yeah.
No.
But they ended up in Baltimore, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah. Was there other friends or relatives or something from Poland that maybe made them come to that area?
I don't know. I know that my mother's maiden name was Anna Matika. And there was another family in Baltimore that she essentially went to. And their name was Matika too. That's why, and I never followed this up, but that's why I wonder whether she didn't accept that as her maiden name. But they provided her with trying to get her. There was a lot of Jewish residents in Baltimore, and they wanted somebody to clean house and to cook for them and things of this nature. And so that's how she got started. And then my father actually came over as a family, because my grandfather on my father's side had had 3 girls and 3 boys, and they had a small farm about a mile away from our house. I know that my grandmother on my father's side died early. She was sickly all the time that I can remember. I don't remember my grandfather dying.
And what did your dad do as a?
He worked for Baltimore Smelting and Refining Company. They refined ore, mostly copper, but they had gold in it and other things that they did. It's a labor.
Yep, yeah. Yep. So besides kind of running the farm, which I guess was there really to provide for the family.
Yeah, well, we didn't break our own bread, things of this nature, and he would, there were a lot of bakeries that would essentially try to get rid of the day-old bread. I mean, they'd give it away. So if he were able to get to that store at the time they were giving it away, he'd get the bread. And pastries too, and things of this nature. Yeah.
Bring it back home, and that's what you had. So I guess those pastry nights were a treat, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
How did you get the job building or working on the B-26 Marauder? Did you just walk up to the factory and apply for a job?
Well, they were hiring like mad. They needed people. So I had no problem in getting the job. And I was basically, initially I was a burr knocker. Do you know what a burr knocker is? All sheet metal that was cut had a burr on it, and that had to be taken off with a file. And then I graduated up to being a welder.
What type of welding?
It was aluminum welding.
Electric or gas?
It was gas. The gas was oxygen and hydrogen. And I never did advance to the heliarc. Ultimately, there was heliarc came into it.
What kind of assembly were you welding on
What kind of what?
assembly were you welding?
I was welding the scuppers.
Describe the scuppers for us.
Well, the scupper was a portion of the aircraft where the fueling nozzle would go into. And of course, there's always a spill, so you had a line that went out of it and out of the aircraft, which they caught, I guess. I don't know, because I was never online. But we made hundreds of those things.
So that wasn't welded in place. It was a piece that you welded, and then someone else placed it in the plane?
No, they would be installed. That piece would be installed in the aircraft.
Okay. Yeah.
It was not welding on the aircraft itself.